Welcome. I'm Kim Wilcox. I'm the Chancellor here at UCR, and it's great to welcome you to the Hayes Press Enterprise Lecture. 58 years ago, Howard, or Tim Hayes, had the vision to start this lecture, and it has enriched our community ever since. Who went to see The Post recently, the movie? Both Catherine Graham and Ben Bradley have spoken in this lecture series. So the sense of the future was apparent 58 years ago to Tim. 80 years ago, though, Amy Lovell sued the city of Griffin, Georgia. She'd been passing out religious brochures, and the city said, you can't do that without a permit. Only the media, the press, can do that. She challenged, went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found that freedom of the press is a fundamental personal right, not just belonging to the media, the established media, the corporate world, but every one of us has the right to share the word in the way that we want the word shared. And it's in that tradition today that we welcome Frank Bruni to our campus. Frank started at the Detroit Free Press, but in '95 he moved to the New York Times. And since then he has been at the Metro Desk, the Sunday Magazine, DC Bureau. He actually covered George W. Bush's run for the presidency, Rome Bureau, the Times restaurant critic for foodies in the room, and now, of course, he's a twice-weekly op-ed columnist covering politics, higher education, popular culture, and gay rights. He's also authored 5 books, and let me read the titles. The Gospel of Shame, Children's Sexual Abuse in the Catholic Church, Ambling into History, The Unlikely Odyssey of George W. Bush from his campaign experience, Where You Go Is Not Who You'll Be, an Antidote to the College Admissions Mania. So he understands college admissions and the kinds of things that are important to us here at UCR. But the last 2, Born Round, The Secret History of a Full-Time Eater, about his struggles with overeating. And the last and most recent book, A Meatloaf in Every Oven, a cookbook. And he also had a cameo appearance in the movie Julia and Julia. But today he's going to talk about current issues with a topic entitled, The News Isn't Fake, but It's Flawed. So in the same tradition that Tim Hayes, 58 years ago, saw a lecture series that would enrich us in the ways pertinent to our times, we're very, very fortunate to have tonight Frank Bruni to talk about media today. Mr. Frank Bruni.
Thank you, Chancellor Wilcox, for that introduction. As you were going through it, especially the book titles, I was reminded that my little brother says I don't have a career, I have an attention deficit disorder. It is a sort of eclectic approach that I've taken. I want to thank the Hayes family for creating this tradition, for continuing it, and for letting me be a part of it. I want to thank everybody here at the University of California, Riverside, for what you do every day and every year. I'm an enormous fan of public universities, and I'm beyond grateful for those like this one that are such powerful engines of opportunity and social mobility. So for that reason, among so many others, I'm really honored to be here at University of California, Riverside tonight. And now I'm going to turn to a slightly less happy convergence, which is that of the president and the press. A little less than a month ago, on the last Saturday of April, Donald Trump, who doesn't exactly like working on weekends, made a quick trip to Michigan for a rally. With any other president, this would have been a visit with a specific and discrete purpose. Maybe the support of a local candidate, maybe the promotion of a bill in Congress, something like that. Or maybe it would have been a gesture of gratitude. After all, Michigan, a precious swing state, helped to give him his margin of victory in the Electoral College. But this is Trump we're talking about, so the rally's message was less thank you than thank and worship me. He touted what he saw as the many accomplishments of his administration so far. He railed against all of the injustices that he must endure. He took little and big digs at Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Maxine Waters, and James Comey, whom he again called a liar and leaker. And of course, he bashed those of us in the media. These are very dishonest people, many of them, he said. And I have to admit that the many of them qualifiers surprised and gratified me. It was atypically generous of the president. Fake news, he muttered. Very dishonest, he groused. They don't have sources, he insisted. The sources don't exist. Well, he was painting this portrait of us as frivolous, sour, and less ethically rigorous than we purport to be. What image were we putting out? Well, the journalists who attended the White House Correspondents Association dinner that very night came across as frivolous, sour, and less ethically rigorous than they purport to be. In tuxedos and gowns, they swanned into a ballroom as thick with self-regard as any Academy Awards auditorium. They took smiley, chummy, arms-around-the-shoulder selfies with the very politicians, proselytizers, and hucksters whom they inveigh against in print and on cable news, thus suggesting to anyone who saw the pictures that shared celebrity heals all grievances, many of which are maybe just for show. And as we all remember too well, they listened to the comedian Michelle Wolf do precisely what she was hired to, exactly what anyone familiar with her work and the tradition of an event like this should have expected her to: savage Trump and his aides, some of whom sat mere feet away from her, in vicious and occasionally vulgar terms. This predictably caused the media's enemies to trumpet that journalists are no more dignified than the president whose indecency they take such offense at. Then, journalists freaked out. In the toxic but apparently irresistible ecosystem of Twitter, dinner attendees and dinner observers debated whether Wolf had shamed Sarah Huckabee Sanders for her appearance, whether reporters rising to Sanders' defense were trying to make nice with a source, whether turnabout was fair play and Sanders and company had such nastiness coming to them, and on and on. In addition to tweets, there were think pieces, and then more think pieces. My own thinking, this Rococo deconstruction exemplified the very self-absorption that got us into this mess in the first place. A friend who knows how limited my Twitter appetite and stamina are and how much I therefore miss, sent me the following tweet from a foreign correspondent for the Washington Post, who wrote, "It's pretty surreal watching from Beijing as the Washington press corps and its critics go bananas over a fancy party. There are journalists in jail. There are sources in jail. Where is the sense of proportion?" Where indeed? A writer for Politico weighed in to note correctly that every caricature thrust upon the national press that we are culturally elitist, professionally incestuous, socioeconomically detached, and ideologically biased is confirmed by this train wreck of an event. And the editor of the Columbia Journalism Review pointed out the inevitability of that train wreck, observing that the event itself is, in his perceptive words, destined to be either sycophantic on one extreme or mean-spirited on the other. Neither is a good look at a time when trust in media is tenuous. I want to repeat that last sentence of his. Neither is a good look at a time when trust in media is tenuous. And I repeat it because the subject of my remarks tonight, and one of my major worries now, is whether we in the media are projecting the right image and making the right impression at a fraught juncture when it matters more than it usually does. With the split screen that I just presented of Trump in Michigan, in Washington Township, Michigan, no less, and the media in Washington, D.C., I in no way intend to draw or imply an equivalence between his values, his vanity, his transgressions, and our own. I do not put the president and the press on the same moral plane. But I do question whether we're paying as much heed to our actions as I think we must. We're under attack by a president whose contempt for a free press is profound and constant. And regardless of the merits of that attack, our response is pivotal to surviving it, to preserving what public trust we hold on to, and ideally to building on that trust in the future. In many ways, our response has been exemplary, a perfect illustration of why we're so vital and President Trump's efforts to delegitimize us are so pernicious. Both the newspaper that I work for and the Washington Post recently won a Pulitzer Prize for reporting on links between Donald Trump and Russia, and thus keeping pressure on watchdogs in Washington to get to the bottom of a question of boundless seriousness. What were the scope and consequence of a foreign adversary's attempts to influence an American presidential election? The newspaper that I work for has also shed light on the workings of Facebook and other social media during that election and how that warped what was going on. Necessary changes are happening as a result of these stories. Journalists are rejecting spin, shrugging off intimidation, and digging and digging and digging. We know of the avarice and corruption of members of Trump's cabinet, foremost among them Scott Pruitt, because of journalistic enterprise. My colleague and friend Maggie Haberman, whose energy and ingenuity are unrivaled, brings us scenes from inside the White House and inside Trump's head that are counterpoints to the talking points, furnishing us with a reality check that's invaluable. But other aspects of our reaction to Trump do trouble me. Because he is so hyperbolic and so dishonest about our vices, we're prone to focusing exclusively and excessively on our virtues. We sing an immodest aria about them. In the face of Trump, my newspaper began its The Truth Is campaign, asserting in television and print ads that the truth is hard, the truth is hidden, the truth is more important now than ever, and so on. The Washington Post put at the top of its front page the legend, "Democracy dies in darkness." Such approaches are part of what prompted the venerable media critic Jack Schafer, who now writes for Politico, to complain that when reporters are maligned, they go all whiny and preachy, wrap themselves in the First Amendment, and proclaim that they're essential to democracy. I won't dispute that journalists are crucial to a free society, Schafer continued, but just because something is true doesn't make it persuasive. The chords that aggrieved journalists strike make them sound as entitled as tenured professors. To be clear, he's using the analogy of professors, not me. I'm quoting somebody else. And I do find his take more than a tad harsh. My own views aren't as unsympathetic, but I fear that we in the media can get so puffed up with our own importance that we lose track of how we're perceived. We forget that Trump's demonization of us finds takers because so many Americans had such a low opinion of us to begin with. We don't probe the reasons for their suspicion and skepticism. Pushed up against the ropes, we're so busy self-justifying that we're not always self-examining. We are not fake, but we are flawed in ways that have rendered us vulnerable to the president and that warrant adjustment. I'm going to discuss some of them tonight, but first, an apology. I'll violate an ideal of journalism and not offer as many specific, detailed citations, names, and proper nouns as I otherwise might. I admit to keen discomfort with appraising, let alone correcting, colleagues. There are enough outsiders who are happy to do that. And I'm in no position to cast stones. In fact, preparing for this talk plunged me deeper into an ongoing contemplation of my own work and its contribution to one of the media's shortcomings, which is this. We indulge too often in snark for snark's sake, using it not because our arguments demand it, but because it's fun and gets attention. And that can make us look petty and silly. I wonder, for example, about a 2016 column that I had an especially good time with. It posited that Trump's hair was a mood ring, with a sometimes golden, sometimes orange, sometimes even pinkish shade that changed from one month and occasion to the next. I theorized that no colorist or trick of the lighting was causing these alterations. No, something more soulful and mystical was going on. I wrote, as Republicans descend on Cleveland for their unconventional convention, my questions go beyond how the GOP will pay for it. I'm in follicular suspense, eager to behold the precise tinge of Trump's tresses, which has been compared to a tangerine, a nectarine, and a grapefruit, though I could make an equally strong case for a lemon. He basically has a whole Whole Foods citrus section atop his head. Well, I'm glad at least it was funny. We columnists at the Times have the prerogative of writing our own headlines if we want to, and I always want to. And the one I put atop this column was The Citrusy Mystery of Trump's Hair. Clever, I suppose, but worth it? On the one hand, I cast his coiffure as a metaphor for his inconstancy and obsession with surfaces. I did point out that we had lavished countless words on Hillary Clinton's hair, not to mention her pantsuits, so this was an evening of gender scores. But still, I played into a caricature of journalists as smart Alecs taking cheap shots from the cheap seats. We have to watch our tone. We really, really do. Take the coverage of Trump's recent state dinner staged for Emmanuel Macron. Review what was written about what Melania Trump wore, or for that matter, the outfits selected by Ivanka Trump and Louise Linton. Using fashion as a prism into politics and treating style as a reflection of values is wholly within bounds and part of a long, distinguished tradition. We in the media did that during the Kennedy administration. We certainly did it during the Reagan administration. And during the second Bush administration, my friend Robin Givhan of the Washington Post justly won a Pulitzer Prize for this. But there was and is a condescension this time around that I don't recall in relation to Michelle Obama's sartorial choices. On the far right, sure, there were pockets and moments of racially coded or blatantly racist viciousness about every aspect of Michelle Obama's appearance. But in the mainstream press, we mostly mooned and swooned. And I don't think that Trump's gleeful vulgarity, in contrast to Obama's decorum, gives us mock-the-frock license when it comes to Melania, Ivanka, Kellyanne Conway, and Sarah Sanders. That mocking certainly doesn't bolster our standing when we then turn around and call out Trump's sexism. Gaping and laughing at these women may be a big hit with a discreet and dedicated audience, but it may also have long-term costs that deserve greater consideration. It's impossible to talk about tone without talking about Twitter, so let's. Are we right to spend so much time there? By we, I mean those of us in the media. Are we spending the right kind of time there? To the second question, I can answer definitively, no. Twitter in and of itself is a powerful tool, an efficient, egalitarian way to spread information and reach big audiences. It's a handy delivery system for news bulletins, for fact checks, for links. But do the journalists who are most prominent and prolific on Twitter reserve it for that? Many don't. Driven by the dopamine of likes and retweets, with an eye on those odometers of approval, we jockey to be bitchiest or most blistering, snidest or most sarcastic. We do somersaults. We do cartwheels. I'm going to defer here to Damon Linker, a columnist for The Week, because I can't describe the frequently uncomely behavior of journalists on Twitter any better than he did in a column last year. He nailed it. He compared Twitter alternately to an endless gossipy cocktail party and to a high school cafeteria, the largest, most raucous high school cafeteria in human history. He argued that Twitter intensifies and amplifies pathological social tendencies among those of us who write about the political world, turning us into petty, vain, childish, show-offy, hostile, vindictive, dogmatic, impulsive, careless versions of our best and most professional selves. This makes Twitter horrible for our politics and equally bad for journalism, he concluded. The single best thing for both politics and journalism would be for Twitter to go out of business tomorrow. That's not going to happen, and we in the media can take solace in the fact that the damage is limited by the paucity of Americans who spend even a quarter as much time on Twitter as we do and who scrutinize what we're doing there. But some of them do notice, and our jibes are plucked from Twitter and used against us. I also believe that the kind of communication nurtured on Twitter travels beyond its confines, seeping into our attitudes and our interactions elsewhere. And that does not ennoble us in the eyes of many Americans, nor does it endear us to them. Linker made another observation that I'd like to mention. Twitter motivates journalists, political operatives too, to mold themselves into what they think their peers and their audience want them to be, which often means more of what they already are. I'm guessing that he's talking principally about how the echo chamber of social media renders people more strident and one-dimensional. But he's hinting too at something that's happening not just on Twitter, but on television and in print journalism, something that potentially eats away at our integrity. More and more of us yoke ourselves to increasingly narrow ideological and oratorical identities that forecast our responses to anything that happens. A particular perspective of ours draws notice. We get bookings for television, for speeches that are based on it and that count on it. It becomes a brand with financial rewards. Press this button and get this argument. We're economically welded to it. And as it grows more fixed, we appear less genuine. Our audience notices. The audience can also sniff out when we're showboating, so we need to avoid that to the extent that we can. This is actually tricky because one of the strategies that both media organizations and individual journalists have embraced in order to compete successfully for eyeballs and survive in tough times is to make reporters part of the story, to put them in the foreground or the middle of it, and to develop and spotlight their personalities so that they're points of connection for readers and viewers and so that they're conduits into the material. Reporters at some of the most staid news organizations, including my own, have a new permission, even encouragement, to appear with frequency on television and to be quick with their quips and with their analysis, which bleeds inevitably into opinion. That blurs the line between chronicler and performer even more than it was already blurred. There's a new generation of podcasts and television projects that take the audience behind the scenes of our work. There are documentaries and documentary-style programs that follow us around. The Times has been featured in several and is poised to participate in more. There's not just a commercial logic to this, but also a higher-minded argument for it. We're being transparent. In sharing with the audience who's bringing them the news and how, we're proving that we have nothing to hide. We're no longer faceless, flawless information autocrats behind an opaque curtain. We're flesh and blood messengers doing the messy best that we can under tense circumstances and against brutal deadlines. But there's danger here too. And it's not just that we might warp the events that we're chronicling along with the chronicling itself by letting it be observed and by turning ourselves and our sources into characters in this other narrative. It's that we seem self-infatuated and self-aggrandizing, and thereby we forfeit trust and fritter away credibility rather than solidifying either. Our navigation of this new terrain requires restraint, judgment, and a sense of proportion. I wonder also about our participation, our continued participation, in the televised White House briefings, most of which have no point beyond our determined expressions as we ask Sarah Sanders a question, our exasperated expressions when she inevitably dodges or gives a vapid answer to it, and our wounded expressions when she insults us. These briefings occasionally produce a tense or ludicrous exchange between her and a journalist that's easily embedded into a blog post or makes terrific spackle for a cable news segment. But they rarely pry loose, meaningful information, and they're a rare facet of the Trump era that both liberal and conservative readers fill my inbox and my ear with complaints about. Conservative readers think that we in the media appear unduly combative and histrionic. Liberal readers think that we're indulging and thus normalizing an exercise in futility and pure fiction. Neither of those assessments flatters us. So why do we keep taking our seats and going through the drill? Several White House reporters have said to me that their presence in that briefing room is a significant statement, a stubborn stand in favor of accountability, a proud bearing of witness. But is that really so if the White House representative at the lectern refuses to be held accountable, to level with us, to say much of anything at all? What are we bearing witness to other than a cynical charade? It's like Groundhog Day for sadomasochists. I don't see how it's doing us any good, not substantively and not optically. We're also poorly served by an occasionally reflexive pessimism, bereft of adequate nuance or a sufficient sense of triage. Don't hear me wrong, I am not calling for some sort of balance that I find missing in coverage of the president and his administration. If his press is overwhelmingly negative, that's because he has earned it. I make no apologies for my own tough columns on Trump. His conduct is cause for immense grief and immeasurable alarm. There's no mandate for on the one hand, on the other hand reporting when both hands are as grimy and deep in the cookie jar as Trump's and so many of his aides and enablers are. But the less worthy shots that we take at lesser actors weaken our impact when our aim is truer. They do that in part by contributing to so much furious protest that it's impossible to hear the signal from the noise. But they also do that by making it easier for our detractors to claim that we're hell-bent on destruction. One bit of recent press coverage raked Mick Mulvaney, the White House budget director, over the coals for some comments of his to banking industry executives that were leaked. He was talking to those executives about his past stint as a congressman, and he said, "We had a hierarchy in my office in Congress. If you're a lobbyist who never gave us money, I didn't talk to you. If you're a lobbyist who gave us money, I might talk to you. Now that's unvarnished and unattractive stuff, and it's certainly worthy of news stories. But many accounts barely or only belatedly informed readers and listeners that Mulvaney also said this: if you came from back home and sat in my lobby, I talked to you without exception, regardless of the financial contributions. And many accounts skimmed over or ignored the reality that this pay-to-play ethos is commonplace on Capitol Hill and practiced by plenty of Democrats along with Republicans. What Mulvaney said didn't put him in a league with Scott Pruitt or anywhere close. We should make those distinctions because doing that gives us greater clout. We routinely leave ourselves open to criticism when we don't have to. There's plenty in the Trump administration to excoriate without any cherry picking of details or gratuitous huffing and puffing. I was so accustomed to the media's eye rolls, grunts, and yelps whenever Trump charged Robert Mueller's principal team of lawyers with being a Democratic cabal that I was surprised when I recently re-educated myself, called up some of those Truth Squad stories, and learned this. 13 of the 17 lawyers under Mueller have registered as Democrats, and 9 of those 13 have made donations to Democrats that are in FEC records. There are no meaningful clues about the political affiliations of the remaining 4 lawyers under Mueller, but for all we know, they could be Democrats too. So while Trump's lamentation makes a big leap and big assumptions and ignores that Mueller himself is a Republican, it's not the kind of utterly wacky fantasy that his claim of Muslims in Jersey City cheering the fall of the World Trade Center is. So we shouldn't treat it that way. We need to resist the temptation to traffic in all the clownish information that comes our way. Cable news, for instance, went wild last month when the lawyer Michael Avenatti released an artist sketch of the man who, according to Stormy Daniels, threatened her and her child in a Las Vegas parking lot. This parking lot incident, mind you, allegedly took place in 2011. The sketch had been commissioned and was being given to the media 7 years later, based on a memory surely hazier than it would have been just weeks or months after the fact. And the sketch was part of a contrived drip, drip, drip by which Avenatti kept the media agitated and rapt. His talk of a mystery disc with images supposedly damaging to Trump, we've not seen that disc yet. His report of a polygraph that Daniels had volitionally taken, etc., etc. Nonetheless, the media merrily played along. On Twitter, journalists had a field day comparing the face in the sketch to famous men. The most popular choice was New England Patriots quarterback Tom Brady. I suppose that was a way of making light of the whole episode, and perhaps it was a sly cue that the sketch shouldn't be taken too seriously. But there we were, talking, and tweeting about it anyway. Some of what Avenatti has pushed into the light is weightier. We learned more about the epically shady doings of Michael Cohen, thanks to him. But some of what he and others feed us is empty calories. It's sugar, and consuming too much of it is bad for our long-term health. We must take pains to paint the fullest possible picture, relate the most accurate history, and provide appropriate context. At times, we fail to. The media's justly skeptical review of Trump's tax overhaul frequently omitted any acknowledgement that Democrats in the past had favored corporate rate reductions, and that much of the disagreement between the parties was about the scale of those reductions, not the fact or wisdom of them. The impassioned back and forth over Trump's decision to declare Jerusalem as Israel's capital often didn't make clear that many politicians before him had pondered or proposed the same step. That doesn't make it a prudent step, but it does challenge the portrayal of the decision as some ploy beyond the pale. We should not, we cannot hand the president any ammunition to discredit us as overzealous partisans having an indiscriminate meltdown. When we answer melodrama with melodrama, we're playing his game by his rules, and he wins. Better to patrol our language and pick our issues so that essential areas of focus, the stacking of the judiciary, the destruction of institutions, the gutting of parts of the government, the transformation of the presidency into a marketing scheme, we don't want these lost in the welter and the whirl. John McCain once explained his staying quiet in the face of some of Trump's bad behavior by saying, "I can't be the car alarm that always goes off." There's some self-preserving wisdom in that. One of my overarching fears about Trump's reign is that he'll drag the rest of the country down to his splenetic, spiteful level. This apprehension goes well beyond the comportment of those of us in the media. I felt it strongly as I watched James Comey, in the service of his memoir, do an utterly conventional publicity blitz that completely stepped on his simultaneous desire to hold himself up as some pillar of rectitude and selfless adherence to a higher loyalty, which is the book's title. He made fun of Trump's appearance. He played along with Stephen Colbert when Colbert mentioned that he had visited the Moscow hotel suite where the P-tape was allegedly made, and offered to answer any questions that Comey might have about the suite. Comey gamely and glibly posed one. Was the area around the bed spacious enough for a germaphobe like Trump to observe the activity on the bed while remaining a safe distance from it? Hearing Comey ask that question made me cringe, not because I myself am a germaphobe, but because his testimony against Trump and his role as a straightforward broker are so important. They're compromised by any hint that he's hamming it up. And Trump seizes on every fumble, every bobble, every glimmer of weakness that he can. That's true when it comes to James Comey, and that's true when it comes to us in the media. It's not fair, but it's what we have to reckon with. Our president would love little more than to utterly invalidate us, because then he can sell whichever alternative facts and whichever ornate fantasies that he chooses to. Then he's untethered, unencumbered, omnipotent. That's a chilling prospect, and that's why we can't inadvertently abet his cause. Every day in my newspaper, in other publications, and on television, I encounter examples of the extraordinary service that journalists perform, of investigations and ruminations that are entirely about making the American project and the world as good and as fair as they can be. Every day my pride in my profession is affirmed, and I'm humbled by the skill and vision with which my colleagues practice it. Look at the work that the New York Times and the New Yorker did last year in unveiling sexual abuse and harassment by powerful men who moved mountains to keep their crimes and misdeeds hidden. Look at political coverage. Look at the Trump coverage. If I again praise my own news organization, I won't be entirely believable. So let me compliment our foremost competitor, the Washington Post, and an epic package that it published this month. One of its veteran reporters, Dan Balls, brought peerless curiosity, empathy, and intelligence to an exploration of how Trump's voters were processing his presidency and what that means going forward. That exploration was built on many months of reporting. It sprawled over many inches of the newspaper, and it rebutted any notion that we in the media are culturally elitist, socioeconomically detached, and ideologically biased, to quote that Politico writer's devastating description of the White House Correspondents Association dinner. I just wish that our rebuttal of that notion was uninterrupted and unfettered. Part of that wish transcends Trump and takes into account trends and tics that predate his ride down that Trump Tower escalator and into history. Remove Trump from the equation, and we'd still have to be mindful of the meld of news and entertainment and the nastiness that infects our work more easily than ever, thanks in significant part to the internet. But Trump is in the equation, goading us. Overreach and exaggeration are his stocks in trade. Let's not make them ours. He conflates the nation's business with show business. We shouldn't follow suit. And we shouldn't answer his grandstanding and his peacocking with our own. It's easy to be distracted and lulled into a false sense of security by the Trump bump in business for many newspapers and networks, whose fans are more passionately engaged than ever before. But that bump may not last forever. It may not last any longer than Trump manages to. And it doesn't do away with the misgivings that a majority of Americans have about us. It's also easy to be so fixated on the ludicrousness of some of the charges that the president hurls at us that we fail to improve in ways that he's not discussing. The news that we report is real, but so is the need to be even better at reporting it. Thank you for hearing me out. And I think that they're going to have me stay up here and a bit longer to take some questions. I hope I do better and fare better than Sarah Sanders, but that's partly up to the way you all behave. Thank you very much.
We have microphones on each side of the stage. For those of you who have questions.
Yes. Hi.
Hey.
My name is Samantha Rita Vigna. I'm a graduate student here in creative
Nice
writing.
to meet you. And your dog.
And my dog. This is Ponam. So I guess I was wondering about if you have thoughts on personal responsibility in response to this. And I think it's kind of a twofold question, one for those of us who are readers and don't have a wide audience, but also for yourself who does have a platform a little bit larger than the rest of us. How do we move forward?
Personal responsibility for
both
what?
Readers, but also for people such
No,
as
personal
yourself.
responsibility in what regard?
In responding to fake news and moving forward to a place where we're having where we're able to do as you suggested and separate between the flotsam and jetsam and divine what is important to discuss.
I hope I'm answering your question. I think I understand your question. Thank you. And I hope I'm answering it with the following, but if I'm not, just tell me. But I think that if I can digress for a second, I think one of the most extraordinary facets of this moment, this juncture, and one of the real challenges is there is so much coming at us. And I think this is kind of instinctive, but also part of Trump's strategy. There's so much coming at us all the time that I think it's very, very easy and tempting to become numb to it and to have it all just turn into a blur. So I think one of the responsibilities we have, or just one of the things I think we'd be well served by, is to kind of process it in a much more considered way and make sure we're not missing the truly grave, the truly consequential stuff, because we're looking at all the shiny objects that are kind of competing with them for attention. Yeah. I don't know if that's a responsibility, but that's one thing I hope for. The other thing I hope for is, and again, I may be digressing a little, but I don't think too much. I hear so many frustrated and really grieving people in terms of where they see the country going, get very angry and spiteful about anyone who voted for Trump. Now, I have people in my own family who voted for Trump. And I hear them like, literally the curse word, say, those people, et cetera. We're all in this together. They're in it with us. We're all one country. And in order to move forward in what I believe would be a more constructive way, I think we can't stop trying to talk to and understand one another. And I think if this presidency just makes us retreat ever further into our partisan corners, I think that would be one of the greatest crimes of it. And I think in that sense, we're being defeated by it because that's not going to do any good for any of us. Is that an answer?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your inspiring speech. You mentioned with Mulvaney that sometimes the press doesn't give the full story, which of course I have to agree with. But it occurs to me, why is it so difficult for the press to ask for evidence? If Giuliani, for example, says something ridiculous about something being true, why is it so hard for the press to say, where is your evidence? When Trump says fake news, why is it hard to say, well, give us in the last 3 days 3 stories that are fake? Announce what they are. In other words, hold the feet to the fire for what brought these people to their conclusion rather than become more stenographers than reporters.
Thank you. I don't think it is hard, and I think we do this. I think part of what you're seeing is a sort of logistical hurdle more than it is any sort of reluctance on our part to say, where's your evidence, or to follow up. I mean, we can ask and we can ask and we can ask, but we can't get it. I mean, we can't make someone respond to a question. You mentioned Giuliani. Some of the interviews he's done, I think people have pushed back. Some of those interviews are in formats, Sean Hannity, Fox and Friends, where they're going to those places, or he's going to those places, because he has a reasonable expectation no one's going to push back at him. When Donald Trump says fake news, fake news, fake news, often it's on Twitter. Are we supposed to all individually tweet back at him so we can ignore it? No, I mean, I think people know our position on what he's saying and the fact that we would like him to offer proof. He hasn't had an honest to good full news conference the count is something like 400. I mean, it's longer. Obama, I read recently, Obama had something like 10 or 11 news conferences from the beginning of his presidency to this moment, and Trump, zilch. Those twofers with foreign dignitaries, where each person gets 3 questions, those don't really count. So if there's no logistical way, if there's literally no mechanism to get an answer to that question, I don't know how we get an answer to that question, but I don't think it's because we're afraid to ask or because we're lazy. And if sometimes we don't repeat the question often enough, I think it's because we know there's not going to be an answer. And at some point, you have to move on to something that might actually extract something rather than just be a broken record. But I don't think we're reluctant at all.
I appreciate that, because with Sarah Sanders, for example, to say what you're saying, she'll just say, do this whataboutism, or else say, well, I'm not talking to you next. So I see there.
Right, which is why I think the answer to Sarah Sanders, and I really mean this, it wasn't just to, I think the answer is to give serious consideration to, or to even stop going to the briefings. Because I don't understand what they're there for except 25 minutes of the most kind of surreal, eye-popping, and yet simultaneously boring TV you could ever. No, it's a feat, those briefings, because for something to be both that riveting and that boring at the same time, it's an emotional oxymoron,
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I wanted to ask a little bit based on a premise. It seems to me that rather than just not in darkness, democracy dies in lack of deliberation about substantive policy questions. And it seems to me that what's been happening is the tit-for-tat give and take of fake news has driven deliberation out of the media, so that we are only getting reports of the latest round of conflict rather than substantive. Very little is understood, for example, about what's in the finance bill.
You mean the tax overhead?
Ought to be understood.
Yeah. Sometimes the way unwieldy and lengthy pieces of legislation like that come together. I think as was being written about and digested, I think you're right. I think very few people knew what was in the tax legislation. Oddly, the same thing was true about the Affordable Care Act when it was passed. I mean, these things come together in such a herky-jerky and strangely last-minute way that it's often not until months or years later that people realize the true ramifications. On your questions of substance, I worry about the same thing. I worry about it not so much for the New York Times, because we have both a dedication, and I'm not just saying it because it's my home team or whatever. We have both a dedication and an amount of real estate online and in print that we can do a whole bunch of things at once. We can give you foreign coverage and the melodrama of the Trump administration. We can give you a careful examination of policy and still do a psychological profile of members of the administration and all of that. When it comes to TV, I think what you're talking about is a bigger problem. I think too often, segment after segment, is just sort of people reacting with wonder or anger or defensiveness to the latest tweets from the White House, the latest this, and I do think a whole lot of the nation's business gets lost. The good news, I mean news in a more generic sense, is that there's enough writing, there's enough media out there that if you go looking for something more serious, you can indeed find it. I was just catching up yesterday on the flight here with some past issues of the New Yorker that I hadn't gotten to yet. And many of you may have read this already, but there's an amazing story by Evan Osnos about what's happening to certain departments of the federal government in which people are being dismissed for sheerly political reasons because they're not, it's not just that their superiors are worried they disagree with the Trump agenda, but they're not kind of cheerleading for it in a conspicuous enough fashion. That's the kind of important story that is still being done. Unfortunately, you sometimes have to work a little harder to find it.
Several things. I mean, Trump is masterful at stating something, and I hearken back to the Iraq War, where the Bush administration had said, oh, they're an imminent threat, they're an imminent threat, they're an imminent threat. And then when that didn't turn out, they switched the message, and they kept saying it over and over again, over and over and over and over and over, until people buy into the new message. And Trump is certainly masterful at that. What I do see, though, is there's the issue of the Fox News and all the other news that's to the right of Fox. I think, you know, you gave a very impassioned talk about being critical of the media and how to report and how you can be better. You don't see that on the right-wing side. You don't see validation of facts. You almost see, if you watch a Hannity, purporting of nonsense. So, you know, I don't know how you counter this when we have a self-selection of what media. I mean, we have the opposite. We have the other tail end of the distribution. In North Korea, you have one state media given a message, and here you have so many media sources that you can pick the one that says what you like.
Yes.
And there's just not a way to convince people on the other side, this fact is true. There is a fact check site. There is a science to back this up, and this is how we prove it. I immediately get from my friends on the other side, this is just fake. That's a lie. It's made up. So I guess my question coming down through all that is, how do you counter that? I have tried and show the facts and pull up science articles, and you just can't be effective with it.
You know, you've put your finger on, I think, one of the problems that keeps me up at nights, which is this fractured information universe, in which there are so many places to go, as you said, the antonym of like North Korea, that you can customize and curate your own news feed. And I think some people do it in a very deliberate fashion. I think some people do it not even realizing that they're going again and again to sources that are reflecting back at them exactly what they want to see in the world, or that are echoing back to them exactly their own voice. Some people do it without even realizing it. I don't know how you or I counters that, except trying to be better in our own personal behavior, to go back to the question about responsibility. I mean, each one of us, and maybe with our own behavior, we can inspire other people. Each one of us can resist the temptation to create a news diet that is all one food group, you know, all conservative, all liberal, you know, or for that matter, all NFL news versus all hunting news or whatever. We can decide that the only way we're going to have connections in our society, and the only way we're going to be able to live together and compromise and talk with one another, is to be a little bit more eclectic in what we take in about the world. I think we're at a point, or we're reaching a point, where we should make that kind of media literacy part of public education. And I say that not because public education is doing its other missions so well, but there are only so many opportunities in society when you have a captive audience. And I think this, when you look at the nature of the internet, when you look at the nature of hundreds of news channels, it is inevitable that people are going to end up constructing these very, you know, monochromatic news diets, I think, before they start making those decisions, whether it's in a considered or just a sort of, you know, happenstance way. I think before that, we need to kind of breed an awareness of what that means, of what it's doing, of why it might not be a great idea. The other thing is, if each of us who cares about that begins privileging those news sources that try to present things from multiple sides, et cetera, those news sources will do better. This is an era where more than ever we're getting the exact news we want, or the exact news we're asking for, because the measurements are instant and the measurements are precise. We know exactly which stories you click on. We know exactly how you came to them, whether it was from a mobile phone or whether it was from a normal PC or whatever. We know how long you stay with that story. And when you see a news organization frequently doing more and more stories of one kind to the expense of others, it's because its consumers are clicking on those stories. So we can change the news with our own behavior if we realize how consequential that behavior is.
Well, I tell my friends, I have a coffee group of everything from anarchists to tree huggers to NRA legislative action, you know, so we all get together with friends and we debate these issues hotly. But I've said we all have a cell phone, we all have a smartphone, and what I like to do is read the same story on multiple sites. And you will typically see across all the respected journalistic outlets, you'll see a similar narrative, and then you'll like read it on Fox.com, and it will be spun a completely different way.
Let me just say one last thing, and let's get to someone else. But we have started a thing at the Times that I'm very proud of. I had nothing to do with starting it, so I can fanboy on it. We have started a thing where there's literally a frequent feature that talks about and collects like the way different reports from different points of the political spectrum in terms of a news event and how it was talked about. RealClearPolitics is a website I have great respect for because it deliberately curates and presents links from across the political spectrum. So if you go to their sort of feed every day, you will see 4 takes on the shooting that just happened in Texas, and they will come from different ideological places. TheWeek.com, which I mentioned before in terms of the columnist Damon Linker, they take a similar approach. So all of those are some places that we can get what you're looking for, and that we could, in supporting, including the New York Times, maybe make the news ecosystem a little saner.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. As a fellow scribe and former editor of the Highlander here at UCR,
Good to meet you.
I have a question regarding the dilution of the power of words. You used one of them in your first question of shiny objects, this euphemism that kind of loses its meaning, that is if we were all easily distracted cats. So my question is, like alternative facts, which is an oxymoron. We take it as there's no such thing as alternative. Facts are facts. Now we're calling it a post-truth. To me, that's an ominous Orwellian concept. What do you think about that, a post-truth era?
I think when it is beyond ominous, but I think it's actually an apt phrase for what people who use it are describing, which is this assault on truth and this seeming belief in certain quarters that what matters is simply what you can convince people of and not what objective reality is. And so I think the phrase post-truth is appropriate. It's ominous. But I mean, do you find that to be an inaccurate description, expression about one of the challenges and situations we find ourselves in right now?
Yes, I think as...
You don't think it's accurate, post-truth?
I'm not sure what it means yet. I think it's very Orwelling. I think that's where we're headed. You mentioned, I think the answer, the antidote is literacy. The gentleman is saying we don't deliberate anything anymore, so it's a mile wide and a quarter-inch deep.
The answer is literacy, but the answer also, I think, goes back, I think, and this is subjective opinion, also I think encompasses something else I said, which is if we lose the power to communicate with each other across some fault lines of different opinions and all that, we lose the power to kind of illuminate each other when somebody on the other side of the fault line, and it could be us, on our side of the fault line, is wrong. So I think our ability to continue talking with each other, coupled with that literacy, could be the answer or antidote to the specter of a post-truth era.
You kind of hinted at it, like Pruitt would be a classic example of this post-truth. We sort of take it, whether it's climate change or a sundry other, the EPA, that they just sort of run roughshod over, and then it becomes kind of accepted because nobody deliberates over it. So that hence post-truth, when it's false to begin with. How could it be post-truth?
I'm just living in this world.
Let's try the other side.
I can't justify it, yeah.
Where you were in your answer to the previous question is where I want to go with the question I have. To what extent do you think journalists are committed, mindful of the need for civil discourse? Because as a nation, we seem to have lost something significant. I became addicted to print media in the run-ups to the election. I subscribed to 3 newspapers, including yours.
Thank you.
And the New Yorker. I read everything and every point of view that I could find. For me, it wasn't a question of literacy. And the tone through most of the election seemed like we had not lost something. But since the election, almost all civil discourse seems to me to have taken a big hit. And we've lost the ability to speak, even among friends, about issues where there are several points of view that need to be revealed. And I don't know if journalists understand that they are marching at the front of an army. If print media is going to survive, journalists, it seems to me, have to continue to model appropriate behavior, opportunity to discuss, to get away from this snarky stuff and to go for the facts, and to make it possible for people to talk, to raise questions, to get legitimate answers. Is that an expectation? Is that a shared value among?
If I understand the question, journalists are as eclectic as diverse as anybody else. Some of my colleagues care genuinely and passionately about civil discourse, and they do, I think, ask themselves the question or try to mold their behavior in a way that doesn't do unnecessary damage to civil discourse. I think others are not especially mindful of that. There are a gazillion types of journalists, there are a gazillion types of news organizations. I can only tell you that I'm mindful of it. I think my newspaper, I think is populated by a majority of people who are mindful of it, who don't always behave exactly in accordance with that principle because, you know,
none of us do.
Because none of us do, exactly, thank you, because none of us do, because the production of news is messy and, you know, it's a daily, hourly thing.
Exactly.
And we make a gazillion mistakes. I think the Times remains a fairly high-minded place. I'm very proud to work there. I thank you for reading it. I compliment you on your exquisite taste. But do all journalists care about it? No. I think enough do to give us some hope, but I would turn it around and say again, we need your help. You can, with your readership, with your viewership, with every measured click of that mouse or, you know, press of a button on your smartphone, you can register your enthusiasm for, your approval of, you know, your support of what you like, and that has an effect that it would, you know, 40 years ago, news organizations would run focus groups and maybe learn a little bit, but they were making decisions in a sort of vacuum. And that wasn't ideal either, because it was all often a group of old white men making decisions in a very kind of blinkered way in a vacuum. So in many ways it's fantastic, and maybe in most ways it's fantastic that we've moved beyond that. But we now have such incredible real-time information about what our readers, what our listeners, what our viewers do. And we have the impulse, in order to survive commercially, to adjust to that, that you all, as I said, have more power. So I'll make you a deal. I will go back and I will dedicate myself to, in a more consistent fashion, talking with my peers in the news business about the preservation of civil discourse. If you will all promise to support news organizations that are making efforts to preserve and promote that discourse and not the other kind. Do you have a deal?
And for those people who don't have a platform in social media, what alternatives are there to make that point of view clear?
I don't understand.
Okay, if you don't have social media, is there another way to make that point of view clear?
To make which point of view clear?
Sorry?
To make which point of view clear? I'm sorry.
To respond to something with praise, honor, questions.
You could do it in your daily life. You could, I mean, you run into and talk to 1 million people every day. I don't think we influenced and informed and interacted with each other before Facebook and Twitter, so we can continue to do that outside the realm of Facebook and Twitter. You can also use, you can use Facebook is often used in beautiful and constructive ways. Some of the most moving, sharing, like kind of generous things I see are through Facebook feeds. Unfortunately, they keep company with a lot of, fake news and bile, but you can use social media in a completely better way.
We need you to the other side, yeah.
Hello. So I had a question. I had actually 2 questions. Not sure if I can ask them. So one is, what is your opinion of media's taking sides and for example being biased towards candidates? Because I know in our last election we had CNN tending towards Hillary Clinton, and they basically ruined the election for Bernie Sanders. So I want to see, and then see if do corporate medias actually push this thing towards journalism, or is it actually the journalists that are biased?
We'll let you do 2 questions if you're quick. What's the second one?
That was the second one, I
okay,
think.
good.
Yeah.
No, separate one.
Those are 2 parts of the first one?
No, this one was the first one.
I got to go get my slippers.
So the second one...
Do you want me to answer them in order? Why don't I answer the first one? Or?
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, again, it depends on the media. There are some, and it depends on the section of the media. There are some media organizations that exist with a pre-announced, predetermined bias. That, you know, it's a sort of European style of news that has become more an American style of news, where if you are turning to Think Progress, or on the other side, if you're turning to the Daily Caller, you are going to get you know, news that is prejudiced in favor of liberals on the one hand, in favor of conservatives on the other. They're announcing that at the outset, so you can't be surprised when that comes about. Within a news organization like the New York Times, I'm allowed, I wouldn't call it biased, I'm allowed to have, indulge and share my opinion, because that's the section I work for, that's the job I've been given. My colleagues on the news side, I mentioned Maggie Haberman, they're not supposed to do that. And it's interesting, because I think Maggie, covering, you know, one of the most provocative and unusual presidents in history, is constantly getting incoming criticism about why isn't every other word and every other sentence of hers, you know, this vile man. And it's because that's not her role. There are plenty of my colleagues on the opinion side who are saying vile and worse. Maggie is supposed to use the methods that are most wise to extract the raw information that we need, so that other people can then tell you what to think about that raw information. CNN purports, you know, except for its, you know, certain kinds of commentators, to be like the Times in its news coverage, more even-handed, more unbiased. You found them to be putting their thumb on the scale in favor of Hillary Clinton, I guess. I didn't notice that in particular, but I will say this. Candidates who have traction already are always going to get more coverage than candidates who don't, because, and it's imperfect, but it's understandable. If we just throw it open and say, anybody who says, I want to be president, we'll give you all coverage, well, then we don't have enough hours, we don't have enough inches. We have to kind of figure out how to accord the real estate. And as imperfect as it is, one of the few sort of, for lack of a better word, fair ways to do it is to give a certain amount of coverage to those people whose activities, whose donations, whose poll numbers suggest that they already have you know, that there's enormous interest in them, and that we're not just inventing that interest from scratch and projecting our own feelings on them. I didn't see as much of a Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders disparity as you did, but your view may be better than mine on that. I don't know.
Well, that's because...
Real quick, because we got a lot of people on the line.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And can I say one other thing? Amount of coverage doesn't necessarily equal bias. No candidate got more coverage in 2016 and 2015 than Donald Trump. But if you went back and looked at that coverage, almost all of it was negative. And I think one of the questions we all need to wrestle with is, what does it mean that coverage of that magnitude seems to help even if it's overwhelmingly negative? Like, I don't think we've yet figured out, I don't think we've yet solved that riddle or figured out what that's all about.
Just a real quick. So my next question, which is really important to me. So what's your opinion about WikiLeaks, and
about
why
what?
is it that WikiLeaks?
Oh, yeah.
And why is it that like medias don't like support them? Because I know for a fact that they release like the evidence and stuff and the truth. Well, some could be biased, but like I see that they sometimes like release some documents where we can actually judge it by ourselves.
I'm going to give you an imperfect and short answer to that, because that is such a huge topic, and I can't do justice to it quickly and get to some other questions. But I believe, you know, in transparency. I believe more information is better, but I also am concerned about theft. And it matters how information, in certain circumstances, it matters how information is obtained. And so that's why I think it's not possible to just have an uncomplicated, yay, let's get like everything. I mean, you know, there's information that's private, there's information that is behind walls for other reasons. We have to be careful, not in the interest of transparency, to promote information theft.
I see. Thank you.
Thanks.
One of the results of social media that is often reported is that it has put a lot of pressure on daily newspapers, and there has been, over the last few years, actually over a fairly long number of years, a considerable consolidation in the ownership and control of both news media in terms of television and in terms of writing. And this reached, it seems to me, a peak when I can't remember the name of the place, but of the company, but the company took over large numbers of commercial television stations and told them they had to report the following. And I'd like you to just comment on the importance of having a diversity and I'm just concerned. I mean, I read the New York Times, and I get it on social. I get it on my Kindle, but it's not that easy to get a diversity of opinion when you've got Fox News, which has become basically a spokesperson, and you can. On the other side, I watch MSNBC religiously, and I wonder, in terms of this growing polarization and the concentration of economic control. As someone who is potentially, I mean, what would happen if your editor started saying, oh, by the way, why don't you include this or that? Do you see this as a major threat, and how do you see a way to maintain the diversity and the number of opinions that are out there if newspapers are closing down, or if they stay open, as our local one does, kind of, but very restricted in the news? And I'd just like your view on how serious a problem do you think this is, and how do you think we try and deal with it to the extent that it is a problem?
Well, I don't really know how to answer that. I don't have a sort of emphatic short answer for you. As it stands now, because the tools of getting information out are so much more accessible and egalitarian than they were before. You know, you don't have to be able to afford a printing press to put something out there. You don't have to, you know, with the barriers for entry for the internet are almost non-existent. So it's not that hard to put information out there, and it's not that hard for any of us to find it with a little bit of effort. I'm more concerned where the corporate thing comes in and what concerns me. And this goes back to the polarization and the partisanship, is it remains expensive to actually kind of report the most difficult news. It costs a lot of money for the New York Times to maintain the number of foreign bureaus that we do and to bring you stories from Iraq that are among the worst read things in the paper, that aren't the things people are clicking on. It costs a lot of money for us to have the number of bureaus throughout the United States that we do. It costs a lot of money for us to take on some of the worthiest projects that aren't going to be super well read. What worries me is there's plenty of people to give you a diversity of opinion, to sit at a computer as I do, and to take the information that other people have unearthed, and at very little cost to the employer relatively, and at very little sweat effort to kind of say, here's what to make of this, here's what I think of this. But that sort of body of unearthed facts that we're all working with, that's shrinking, because that's what costs money, that's what corporations don't want to pay for. So I'm less concerned with their ending up being, because of corporate ownership or anything, a sort of like a homogeneousness of opinion. I'm worried that we're going to have trouble knowing what's going on because local newspapers are shutting down and no one's at the city council meeting. You know, no one's, I mean, Colorado has so few political reporters left, you know, that you'll have one reporter covering both the State House and campaigns and this and that. So much is being missed in the universe of retrieving information. That's what worries me.
We've got, looks like 2 here, 1 there, and that's what we're going to be able to handle.
As a former press secretary from Colorado.
So no, but have you noticed the desiccation of Colorado media and the political press corps?
Yes.
It's insane.
25 years ago, I was the press secretary for the mayor of Denver. And it was during the building of Denver National Airport with the problems that we had, the baggage system. Some people may be
Yes,
old enough to
remember.
remember we made David Letterman's top 10 list. But
probably more than once, right?
well, just once, but it was enough for me. What I remember about that time, Mr. Bruni, is that
Frank, please.
Well, Briggs, is that we would have pretty intense press conferences about as we missed 4 openings of that airport. And they were fairly intense, but they were discourse. They were tough grilling by reporters. There was an effort for us to get the answer out. Maybe it was bought, maybe it wasn't, but we were held accountable, and we felt that we had to respond to the question being asked. Now, we may have tried to put out a message, and we may have tried to to route our answer back to that message at times, but we couldn't get there unless we at least made a passing glance at the reporter's question and engaged in a discourse. And what I'm hearing, and really in the answer to your previous, the person over there was, is discourse gone? Is discourse going away? Sarah Huckabee doesn't answer the question. I think you're right. Maybe just stop going to these press conferences, these press briefings, because there's not a discussion. There's not a give and take. I'd be fine if she were answering the question if she wanted to blow her stack at someone she disagreed with, but that's not what's happening. So are we, even setting aside the civility of the discourse, are we losing discourse?
Well, I think we're talking about a couple of different things. Because there's the discourse that we have with, I mean, to me, what I hear you saying, we're talking about two different things. One is that the press conference is a different kind of, that's not traditional discourse. I think we're losing, or we have two different things endangered at once. One of those things is truly, the press conference that you described as a paradigm of truly accountable government, right? I think I think truly accountable government is jeopardized, it's in danger by the fact that so many watchdogs are going away. And by that I mean principally the press. If you've got local governments and state governments that are essentially operating without media scrutiny, that's a really, really dangerous thing. So I worry that that sort of accountability is going away. And then I worry separately when it comes to the way voters, constituents, and then as a reflection of that, lawmakers speak to each other, that everybody is existing in very narrow, predetermined ideological enclaves, never to emerge from those and to see everything as partisan warfare. There are a lot of people, and again, when I speak of this, I speak not only because I did go to rallies, I talk to them, not because I talk to people all the time, but because I have a family that's very politically heterogeneous. There are a lot of people who voted for Trump not because they were able to convince themselves that there were admirable things about him, not even because they were able to convince themselves that he was more likely than not to be an effective president, but because he was the appointee of their tribe. He wasn't the Democratic nominee, he wasn't Hillary Clinton. And whatever flaws he had, he had the imprimatur, the stamp of approval from the tribe, and you voted with the tribe. That concerns me greatly. What happened to swing voters? What happened to the middle? What happened to compromise being not a dirty word, but a noble one? That concerns me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Looks like we're down to our last question here.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, sorry. I'm not good with mics. But I'm actually kind of glad that I went after the last two questions because it kind of, is based off both of those. Given what you said a little earlier about what we're seeing with the demolition of local news sources, shifting the perspective a little bit, because that's a huge issue in the IE. For example, even our benefactor, Press Enterprise, their office has kind of been shrinking over the last few years. So for people who are chasing those stories, for people who are maybe, journalists in areas that are kind of more local or who are focusing more at a local level, is there any advice you would give about chasing these harder stories and retrieving these facts, given that the resources we have are slowly drying up?
That's a great question. I wish I could say, yes, I know exactly what to tell you, and here's how you solve that. The truth is there's no easy solution to that or happy answer to that, because you have to be able, you may be the most principled, high-minded, committed servant of the truth. And at some point, you have to pay your rent or your mortgage. And if you can't make a living covering the city council, or back when I was younger, I had people who went to work for newspapers to cover the local water board. The idea that there would be a reporter going to a water board meeting now is exotic, right? So part of the answer is you have to decide you really want to do it at great personal sacrifice. But the other part of it is this. I think that if you are a tenacious reporter with a keen eye and with stamina, and you're covering those things, you are going to end up tripping across something that is interesting beyond those local parameters, that's interesting in a much bigger way. And because of the internet, you will be able to get that story out in a way that will find an audience and that may end up changing your life and changing the lives of the people you're reporting on. So there is something that is less apocryphal and more accessible than a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, but that's what I'm talking about. There is a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow.
What a great finish. Please thank Mr. Bruni.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you all for having me.
And I invite everyone out to the courtyard for a small reception, please.